everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some non-fantasy with my friend Charles.
Fantasy adjacent in many ways. I'm ready to talk about it as well, Dylan, and that's because we've got a, author who has dabbled in best-selling fantasy, but this book
more than dabbled, Charles.
I'm being modest here. We are big fans of this author, and they have gone into the world of popular fiction with much success as well. And so, Dylan, you've gone and read the story, and you're bringing it to us today. I mean, we have a lot of reading to do. Anyone following along with the show knows that we just finished Friends Pitching Fantasy, and we've got a lot of reading to be done, starting with The Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, and then we are going to go into Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. But, while we're reading that, another episode must be recorded, and thankfully Dylan has done a lot of extracurricular reading, and I think this is an interesting book to talk about. I'm very curious about it, and it's been on my TBR to read as well. And Dylan, why don't you take it away and let us know what we're here to talk about?
Yeah, we're here to talk about Yellowface by Rebecca Kuang, or R.F. Kuang. Mm-hmm. And I got into this book. I audiobooked it. It's a pretty quick read compared to the fantasy that we're used to, even the fantasy that we're used to by this same author. And I believe I've read everything that Rebecca Kuang has written. I've read the whole Poppy War Trilogy, As of You. I've read Babel, which you have not gotten around to yet.
Nope.
But I went out, I was like, I really love Kuang's work, and now she's publishing this capital F fiction, not fantasy.
Right.
And it's been this breakout hit, as I think we all kind of knew it would be. And she's forayed into the, just capital F fiction world in a way that she was #1 New York Times bestseller with this one, I believe, or was that Babel?
I don't know, but I have seen this book on, it is a indie bookstore darling. I've seen it, on the glass. I see it right when you walk in. It's being prominently featured right now. It is this breakthrough success. I wouldn't be surprised, given the amount of distribution it's getting and notoriety that it's getting, if this wasn't hitting any kind of accolade like a bestseller. Certainly up for awards, I'm sure, as well, and this and that. And that's just the vibe I get from the news surrounding it. I haven't actually read it. I've only read The Poppy War, and I loved it. I'm a huge fan of Kuang's writing style, and I'm here to talk about it, and I'm curious to see what you have to say. Maybe if you can convince me to bump it up that TBR.
Oh, yeah. I will say, I do think it was Babel that was the #1 New York Times bestseller, but I'll say that it recently became the pick for Reese Witherspoon's book club. Are you aware of Reese Witherspoon's book club? That's a huge audience that follows that. So and I mean Reese Witherspoon, and we're talking about, if not still A-list, certainly a person who has been A-list.
Definitely,
yeah. So it's a big deal. We're talking about someone who we remember reading when she was far from a household name and was producing these awesome military fantasy books, and now we've watched her rise to this point where she's getting picked by Reese Witherspoon as the author of the book for her book club. So it's
I remember when The Burning God came out, back in 2020 when we first started the show, and we wanted to, we had a reading schedule, and we actually stopped it. It was for the first time ever we deviated from our reading schedule to read the Poppy War and the Dragon Republic in time for the Burning Gods release. And, when you first start a show, it's like, but the schedule, everyone's, we're on the schedule. But it's like, why don't we just...
Maybe that's more of a you thing, Charles.
That's fair. But it's like, we can read whatever we want, whenever we want. It's kind of like no one's stopping us from doing that. And so we're like, we kind of want to read R.F. Kuang's Poppy War right now. It just is hitting the right vibes, and we want to be prepared for Burning God. And so that was a fun time. And then she's had quite a busy 3 years with Babel that came out last year and was an international bestseller. And then Yellowface coming out very recently this year. So she doesn't show any signs of slowing down either. And even in her academic world, she continues to excel. I think she's now pursuing a PhD at Yale. So things are just going to keep moving onwards and upwards for R.F. Kuang. And this is only just the next phase in that trajectory. So that's another thing that it's interesting when fantasy writers, and it's weird, I don't want to describe R.F. Kuang as a fantasy writer, but as an author who wrote successful fantasy, to make that pivot to the book club, capital F, fiction sphere. That is a way bigger audience, way bigger market. And once you hit the book club circuit, that's pretty special. That's a hard thing to top. That's a lot of books. You're going to be showing up in airport bookstores. You're going to be showing up in Target. You're going to be that's just a whole nother level of success, which some fantasy authors do make, George Martin and Brandon Sanderson you see in on these places. But it's interesting to see the ability to do both, and kind of that swing. Babel kind of feels like an in-between of fantasy and fiction, and then you've got the Yellowface, I sound like the Facebook. You've got Yellowface, and it's kind of the more full swing into full fiction, right? There's no fantastical elements in this at all.
Yeah, it is just like any other book you would find in the capital F fiction section of the bookstore, your local bookstore. And I think that, but yeah, like you're saying, you don't have to go to your local bookstore to find this one anymore. You might just have to go to the airport when you're traveling and stop in their little airport bookstore, or be in a Target and walk by it. I mean, this book has been... I've been seeing it everywhere, and it has been an interesting journey for us, where 3 years ago, she was a fantasy author, but not at the level of popularity of, let's say Sanderson, because he's an easy example. It was just not even close to that level of popularity back then. Like a fantasy author that was finishing up her trilogy. I brought up the Poppy War to you, and I think you hadn't heard of it before, and that's not a take on you or your knowledge of the fantasy genre, which is obviously vast, Charles. Right. It is more of a, even people who read a lot of fantasy, as she was finishing up the Burning God, might not have really known her work, or might have heard of it kind of tangentially. So to see her rise from that to Reese Witherspoon's
and she
book
was the way I kind of remember being exposed to her in the beginning. My early impression of her was she writes violent stuff, and she writes things that make people cry, buckets of tears, and this and that. She was known, and she was pulling from historical
grimdark, really,
references.
Grimdark military fantasy.
And her books were when we finally read the Poppy War trilogy, it was these are intense, action-packed, fast-paced books, very much rooted in militaristic fantasy, which to not necessarily, I'm not going to say rebrand, because it's still very much on brand for R.F. Kuang, but to make that pivot, expand your brand in such a way where, you have all this literary knowledge, this academic experience, and you're able to take a lot of those complex themes and ideas and express them through a wider genre of fiction is an interesting pivot to make. And you compare to other authors like N.K. Jemisin, who has kind of stuck to sci-fi and fantasy, and has it would be like if she wrote a like a book club picks like fantasy, not fantasy fiction book, and it's like not a lot of authors do
Which is
that.
kind of hard to imagine, though. I'm
Yeah,
sure
right.
she clearly, I mean, N.K. Jemisin is one of the great writers of our time, in my
Oh yeah,
opinion. Like, she clearly
fantastic.
has the chops to do
Fellow
that,
Tulane
but she
alum, by
hasn't
the way.
ever. Oh, yeah. No wonder you're a huge fan. So, yeah, obviously has the chops to do that, but has not ever made the choice to kind of go in that direction. And I don't know. I don't think Rebecca Kuang wrote this thinking like, oh, I'm going to write a book club book. I think she wrote it for the purpose that she states it's kind of a takedown of the publishing industry. Like, she's got all these TikToks she'll put up about like, oh, I convinced HarperCollins to publish a book that takes down the publishing industry, including HarperCollins. So it seems to be a Rebecca Kuang, I guess, pattern that she goes with her books. Like Babel is a takedown of like these really prestigious academic institutions, which she was a part of. She's gone to Oxford, as you said, and Yale, and she gets into these worlds and then she observes the structural problems, often particularly oppression or with the academia stuff, like imperialistic aspects of it and all of that. And she then writes her like hit piece on that institution. It's kind of like, well, now she's writing her hit piece on publishing, which she's also obviously very well acquainted with. So I don't know where she's gonna attack next, but watch out if you're on her hit list.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We don't need that kind of heat, but she brings it, it sounds like, because the premise of this story is, the book's called Yellowface, right? And it's a very out there, like, very in your face cover, which I love the branding for this book. The cover is incredible. But then I think you'll probably want to get into the synopsis since you've read it, but it sounds like this is like a no holding back kind of story right from the synopsis.
Yeah. So the basics of it, I won't read this whole Goodreads synopsis, but the basics of it is the main character is June Hayward, and she's friends from back in her undergrad days at Yale with this woman who is named Athena Liu. June Hayward is kind of this like mid-list author who's gotten lost in the publishing industry, and she's a white woman. And then Athena Liu is an Asian American woman who has had massive success. In fact, like, there are ways in which I would see some self-insertion going on with the Athena Liu character, because Rebecca Kuang writes about all these like awards that Athena Liu is receiving, and all of these
Went to
like
the same
accolades
schools
and
as R.F. Kuang
praise
and this and that.
right. Also, Yale is like, there's certainly, and Rebecca Kuang writes from her experience and weaves some of it in. In no way is Athena like a direct parallel for Rebecca Kuang, but just her massive success at a young age speaks to a lot of what Kuang has experienced. So either way, we have this and this is in the synopsis, this is not a spoiler, and this happens extremely early on. It is this strange situation where June witnesses Athena's death in this like freak choking accident when they're hanging out at Athena's place, and they have this sort of like frenemy relationship where June is just like super jealous of Athena's success, and Athena is kind of like in her own world with like not truly understanding like what June's experience has been like.
Your classic Goku Vegeta kind of relationship.
Sure, but calling June presumably Vegeta in this situation is probably giving her way too much credit. Like, Vegeta, sure, wasn't quite at Goku levels, but was definitely a formidable opponent. June is not so much, but she's at Athena's place. Athena legit dies, and then her just finished masterpiece of a manuscript is just sitting there, just begging for June to steal it, apparently. And it's this sort of it's described on Goodreads as an experimental novel about the unsung contributions of Chinese laborers to the British and French war efforts during World War One. So it's written from someone who's I believe Athena's parents came from China, so she's first generation, and she's writing this book that goes back into things in her background, her heritage, maybe is better said. And then now it's in the hands of this white woman who's decided to steal it, and goes on to write the book and receive a lot of attention and has a much more successful experience, rewriting this novel in a way that kind of takes some of the teeth out of the criticism of the British and French folks in World War One, and kind of whiteifies it, for lack of a better phrase, and then goes on to have massive success. As in the synopsis, it says, June reaches New York Times bestseller list and all that kind of stuff. So it raises all these questions about who can tell what kind of stories, can a white woman tell a story of Chinese laborers during World War One? Obviously you can't steal books from other people. That's a bad thing to do. Right, but it does kind of get into these topics and how society reacts to them and how the publishing industry reacts to them. So you're dealing with these questions, as Goodreads says, questions of diversity, racism, cultural appropriation, not only in the publishing industry, but the persistent erasure of Asian American voices and history by Western white society. So as usual, Kuang is diving into the hot topics and the controversial topics in a way that heavily draws from her own experiences and criticizes the publishing industry in a satire with a very unlikable protagonist who does some pretty messed up things. So that's kind of how I would explain Yellowface.
Well, I mean, it is an interesting premise, and one of the things that kind of is piquing my interest here is in the genre tab with all the keywords and stuff. Sometimes I'm seeing psychological fiction, other times I'm seeing thriller and mystery. Is there components of these in that story? What kind of story is this? Is this a satire / critique, or is there something psychological and thrilling going on at the same time?
There's certainly a lot of psychological stuff going on in this, and I obviously appreciate that as someone in the field. Just getting into her June's rationalizations of these really messed up things that she's deciding to do, and how someone can keep telling themselves I'm not doing anything so wrong, while they steal someone's book and engage in some of these racist behaviors. And I think that those kind of things, the rationalizations, are very interesting from a psychological perspective. There are moments that start drawing from a mystery aspect of of genre. I would say there are moments that feel like a thriller, just in terms of I basically audiobooked this in a day. It keeps moving and it keeps you wanting to know what's happening next. But I don't know, the things that the words thriller and mystery evoke for me, thriller evokes that there's a level of danger and action that isn't exactly taking place in this, and maybe that's why the subgenre of psychological thriller is in there. But even then, I'm I don't know. I think about these pretty intense movies when I think about psychological thriller, in a way that I would not say this really fits. If I think psychological thriller, I'm thinking about I don't know, Gone Girl, You know what I'm saying? Which I guess another good
Interesting.
example, because the book, right? I'm saying that's what I would think if you said psychological thriller.
Oh, yeah,
I would
yeah.
not compare this book to Gone Girl.
Okay, I was gonna say, whoa, because
So,
Gone Girl's
no,
juicy, boy.
no. I would say it's not like
Okay,
that.
got
And
it.
that differentiates it from what I think when you say the phrase psychological thriller. Or like, let me think, like Memento or something like that, right?
Unreliable
It's
narrator kind of thing.
which it does have an unreliable
Oh,
narrator for the
interesting.
record, because the whole thing is written first person from June Hayward's point of view,
That may be
and
where some of these websites are kind of reaching for keywords, you know?
yeah, and there are mystery elements that pop up. Like, I won't say for spoiler reasons, we're gonna keep this spoiler free.
Thank you.
I won't say what mystery elements pop up, but there are certainly moments where it's like she's trying to figure out something and the reader is following along. But it's like those are subplots that pop up throughout a book that is largely, to me, like the satirical critique of the publishing industry in the form of an extremely entertaining story. Like, I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. That, like, even if it's hard to say this because the critique is so integral to what the story is about, but if you were completely like oblivious to those themes and how they're playing out, I still think most people would find this just a very enjoyable story because of the elements, like keep it moving, the interesting characters, even if they're not super redeemable or anything like that. But yeah, it's not what I would think as a thriller or mystery, maybe psychological thriller, but even that seems more the stakes, like, I don't know, when I think like thriller, psychological thriller, it's like people are in mortal danger, which I guess Athena Liu was when she choked on a pancake, but not in the way that I would normally think for psychological thriller.
Golly, choking on a pancake. What a way to go.
Yeah. It's not how I would want to go. But
Well, it
at
seems
least on a
like
waffle
a lot of
or
stuff.
French toast.
Oh, yeah. Belgian
If I had to-
waffle, maybe. Yeah.
Sure.
'Cause
I
those
like
are
pancakes
like
better
more
than waffles.
formidable. Yeah, I tend to gravitate
Oh,
towards
you're
the
like
pancake
thinking
myself.
you're like thinking about like how people would think about your dying by choking on a pancake. Like, oh wow, really, a pancake? Like, those things are flimsy.
No, I'm just
But
considering other things because those can turn into a paste, man. You know that can close up the esophagus real good, and you could put things like
yeah,
powdered sugar on there. You know, like there's choking hazards there. Big chunks of
it's
fruit.
dangerous.
I don't know. It's dangerous. If you don't have a glass of milk nearby or something, like, it could be even more
I don't think
troublesome.
milk would have saved her.
Not if it's you got.
You always milk is like your answer for everything, Charles. All right, I know
I'm
you
just saying,
come from a milk forward
Vitamin
family.
D. Yeah, my family was very
You
milk
were a very
forwards. Thank you for
milk-forward
outing me in front of everybody. We had a lot of milk.
Yeah.
Okay, sue me.
But he grew so
It was
tall,
a different
so-
time. All right, there were not.
Was
it was
it?
like soy milk. You know, that was the alternative. We don't have all these fancy almond milks, oat milks, like.
Yeah, but just to be clear, this was pure dairy milk. I'm assuming whole milk.
It was 2%. We never did whole. We did 2.
Like, but the
Don't
whole
put that on
plant, like the whole family was milk forward, but look at how tall they are. Like, if you look at, for the record, if you look at pictures on social media, I'm average height. So when you see these pictures that are like Charles towering over me, that's just this man who has consumed so much milk that he grew to gargantuan sizes. So
It was all the milk, and I got good bones, all that stuff that
Right.
comes along with it. Don't ask me about my digestive system, but everything else, real nice, real nice. I don't know if fans need to know that today. I was just trying to
Definitely
say that
not.
milk could have maybe helped dissolve some of the pancake batter, but and it would be common to have milk with pancakes, okay? Like, it's not that crazy of an idea.
in your
Like,
family.
who
very
has
common.
water with pancakes, okay? Like, you need something to drink. And
Maybe orange juice. Or
orange
like
juice,
that.
that's
Tea.
another good one. Juice is good. Coffee, they could have reached for tea.
Of course, classic.
Yeah, classics. But, besides the point, sometimes that pancake stuff gets so thick that there's just no breaking it down in time before you choke and die and leave your manuscript behind for other people to take and claim as their own. It's an interesting premise. It almost gives, it's like, I don't know, I can see like potential cool indie movie vibes from it. Like I like the premise quite a bit. It's a unique one, and I think there's a lot of meta stuff going on pulled from R.F. Kuang's experiences, which I also find, since we've been following her since 2020, I find the meta aspects of the story to be particularly interesting as well. This idea of someone who is so experienced in publishing and in academia and in book promotion and in Asian history and this and that there seems to be a lot of commentary coming through from her own experience. And I think we're seeing that a lot with authors, especially like using social media as a way of gaining notoriety and popularity and building your own fan base. You kind of develop your writing, your public persona. And I think we see that a lot more than we used to. Like, sure, there's always been writers that have had personalities like Hemingway and this and that, but it's a lot rarer because there just weren't a lot of like ways to get the personality of the author so frequently like we can today with social media. And I feel like R.F. Kuang is one of those personalities that exists on social media, and she's kind of built this whole narrative beginning with her commentary on social media and the topics that she likes to explore in her personal life, and it kind of continues in Yellowface. So I think there's almost like another experience to be had there. I don't know, Dylan, were you getting a lot of that kind of meta commentary from Rebecca in this book?
For sure. And Rebecca has become I would say, TikTok darling, and that has contributed to her success. I think that she is mostly critical of social media in this book. Like, she has, she always has nuanced takes on everything. Like, she shows the role that social media can play in building buzz about an author. Probably that's not a great thing when the author is a white person who stole a book from an Asian American woman, right. But shows the role of it in that sense, but also just the Twitter mobbing and the constant, like, how negative it is for your mental health. I mean, there's points where it's like it can look like an author, like their entire life is crumbling around them because they're getting canceled on Twitter or whatever. And then they like go and have a barbecue with their friends, like, touch grass, as the kids like to say.
As the kids like to say.
Right.
For sure.
And like hang out with people who are not in the publishing industry and not like on book Twitter or book talk or what have you. And then they're like, oh, hey, like, how's your writing going? Like, I heard you published a new book and sounds like a lot of people are reading it. Like, that might be the reaction, or they might not even know that a new book was published or anything like that. And kind of the discrepancy between living online and how that can affect you and how you can think like Twitter is the entire world, and then comparing that to like, well, the real world kind of exists mostly independent of that, and you're in your own little like Twitter space. And we're in the book Twitter space, and it's interesting to see these things that feel like giant controversies or what have you, and then it's like the percentage of people in your day-to-day life who actually are plugged into that, besides if you're like in the publishing industry and you go and like see all the people all the time who also are in the publishing industry, but your family and friends for the most part who are likely to not be in that industry, like, have no idea what's going on, but it feels like it's everything to people who are chronically online. And
right.
I don't mean to like say that in a derogatory way. Obviously, I could use a little bit less time on social media myself as the
Couldn't
person who
we
runs our
all?
accounts. Yeah.
Interesting. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see how it's kind of hard to separate R.F. Kuang, the personality, from the characters and the events and the like talking points in this book. And I find that to be an interesting experience. But I wonder, you know, I think for people going into this, if this is their first R.F. Kuang book, I find they may get more out of it to like read the about the author and learn more about her as an individual, because it kind of contextualizes the book, which is an interesting position for an author to take. Is not unheard of by any means. And I think we're seeing a lot of those stories being told in the past couple of years, especially in fantasy, but in popular fiction, it's been a thing for a long time of like, you want to read about the personality, you know, it's like every celebrity has their own book. And you know, it makes like, there was the one which like, I'm Glad My Mom Died, which we both read and loved, where it's like the personality of the author adds that extra value to the reading experience of the story. In that case, it was like a biography, but you can see it in works of fiction as well. And it sounds like that's what's coming through here. There's a lot to enjoy in the meta aspect of this and learning of R.F. Kuang, the author, beyond just what's written in the story.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that the choice she made was the of the two authors that are prominently featured, even if one dies pretty early, like her ghost looms large over the story because the book is stolen from her. It's like the author whose experiences mirror Kuang's to a greater extent is the the character that dies, and not the main character, nor the character that is the first person narrator. That's June Hayward. And it's kind of written from, I would say, the point of view as the person that Kuang would see as more the villain in this story, although the greater villain is probably the publishing industry, right? If we put this in our fantasy terms that we better understand, it's like sometimes there's the bad guy or what have you, and then there's the big bad, right? And
Right.
you might face the regular bad at the end of the first book, but we're going the whole trilogy in our typical fantasy series before you take down the big bad. And it's kind of, I guess, the big bad here is the publishing industry, and the bad is the protagonist. Actually, in June Hayward, it's kind of taking on the perspective of a white woman stealing the work of a person of color, and that's very interesting choice that Kuang made. It definitely helps her make the point, I think, much better than if obviously Athena's dead pretty early in this, but if she chose to tell a story that was more like the character whose book was stolen is still alive and dealing with the ramifications of someone stealing their work, she could have made that choice, but she did not. And it makes the book awesome from those unreliable narrator aspects of it that we were just talking about. There's a character that is constantly trying to convince the reader, trying to convince themselves that what they're doing is okay. And you can see how someone who, is she well-intentioned or not? I guess that's up to the reader to determine. I don't think she's necessarily well-intentioned, but she certainly sees herself as a better person than she actually is, which I think is right. That's very common, where people see themselves as the hero of their own story.
Sure.
And I would say June sees herself as more of the hero of her own story, like the way that she's like, well, doesn't this story deserve to be told? And it never would have been told if it weren't for me, because Athena died and it just would have been left unpublished. It's like those kind of rationalizations are where a lot of my interest lies, just from like, I enjoy seeing people's psychological processes play out. So I think Kuang's choice to draw from her own experience while taking primarily the role and the voice when it comes to narration of a character whose experience is entirely unlike her own is, well done by Kuang.
Wow. So, I mean, it's a great sell, right? There seems to be a lot to get into here. It seems like a relatively faster read for those of us used to reading fantasy door stoppers and trilogies and things like that. So I guess the last thing I want to kind of discuss before we call it a day here is, like, who would you recommend this book to, and especially coming from the lens of our audience, which may be more fantasy inclined?
I'd recommend it to Reese Witherspoon.
Wow, and you would have had a good recommendation because she loved it.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's I didn't really dive too deep into, like, does Reese read the book first and then decide it's good?
I mean, sometimes it's like Oprah's book club, where it's like it's run by a company and, you know, people are picking stuff for a variety of reasons. But it typically means that they've read it, and I believe that she's read it. You know, why not?
Yeah, I believe. I just don't know the format of, like...
She attached it to her brand anyway.
Reading the book along... What's that?
She attached it to her brand, and my understanding is it's more like a influencer thing, like Oprah's O-List or whatever, where it's like,
yeah,
maybe they'll do a write-up on it, but they put it on the list, and that's just what people will, like, know to, like, when they're planning their next book club, what to, like, recommend and where to look to find books to recommend in their book clubs and things like that. I think. I don't really know.
It's not like a read-along with Reese situation.
Right. She's not going to release a 2-hour-long book discussion about it 2 weeks from now, you know, like we do.
Unlike us. Yeah, that's fair. And I would never ask Reese to...
No, she's got a lot on her plate as it is, you know. We just appreciate the rec.
We do appreciate the rec. Who do I recommend? Because this is an interesting concept for an episode from our podcast. Like, how many times have we talked about books that are not fantasy or sci-fi or historical fantasy? I guess it's still fantasy because I'm just
rare.
The Judas Blossom, which we just covered, extremely rare, if at all. Like, have we ever done it before? I don't know. And but it made sense to us because we know. I mean, like, our Poppy War episode is one of our most downloaded episodes. Like, we got to be in the top 10, I think. So we know our listeners are well acquainted with Kuang's work, and it's definitely a situation where I think they would have interest in just seeing this from the perspective of Kuang's evolution as an author. Like, that's what drew me to this, because if this book... I'm sure I would have enjoyed it anyway, but if this book was written by someone who wasn't Rebecca Kuang, it just does not fall into my typical, like, genre that I would choose to read. I'm so... I gravitate right toward that fantasy and sci-fi section immediately upon entering a bookstore, and whether it's good or not, for me, because I gave this 5 stars. Obviously, this was a very good read for me. I just don't think to go to some of these Reese book club type books, and I would recommend it to folks who are obviously fans of Rebecca Kuang, but then they might, I know some folks have reservations about, like, well, I'm a fantasy reader, like, do I even want to read this? And I would say, yeah, and I think it's such a quick read compared to what we're used to as fantasy readers, and it's just a really good read, and it's kind of... I'm just interested to see what some of the people like me who read mostly fantasy think of it. It's So anyway, the people are Rebecca Kuang fans, of course. See if you think it's worth taking the next step and reading something that's outside of fantasy by her. I think then it is. It's another one of those books. Like I looked it up. New York Times bestseller, though she didn't say #1 New York Times bestseller. She said New York Times bestseller, so somewhere on the list.
Don't give it time. It just came out.
And also #1 Sunday Times bestseller. So I guess it's really jumping off the shelves over in the UK. And I think that it's another one of those situations where it's like, who do I recommend the New York Times bestseller / #1 Sunday Times bestseller book to? Like, kind of everyone. But also the like people who are interested in these ideas of like diversity, racism, and oppression, and like how these things play out in the publishing industry. Of course, like I think that it's like for me as someone who is like tangentially related to the publishing industry, because we have plenty of friends involved in the publishing industry. We interact with people who are publicists, and we interact with authors, of course, and we learn about what their experiences are like. Like I think there are ways where I'm like, oh, this kind of like makes sense with what like I don't know, like Sarah El-Arifi was telling us about, and like her experience. So there's moments where for me that kind of hits a little bit harder, or hits different, as the kids are saying. Sure. Because I'm like, oh wow, like this stuff definitely really happens. And then there's like these things that appeal to anyone who are interested in these topics. But I would say that like there's times where I found myself recommending to people that are like aspiring authors or involved in like I have a second cousin who's like edited a book and that got published a while back, and I was like, oh, you know what, you'd probably really like this because you have an idea what this world looks like. So we have plenty of listeners I know that are authors, aspiring authors. I know publicists listen, and other podcasters in the book universe. So I would say all of you folks who are listening, this is like a must read. I just have trouble calling things must reads though, because I'm like, do whatever you want. Like you don't must do anything. Do whatever you want.
If you want to read, you know.
Yeah, all books are if you want to read for the most part in my eyes. But go for it. You're gonna enjoy it if you're in the publishing world.
And FDF, sure, go for it. Approval right there. And it's funny because I read...
See, this is why we're not going to end up... We never get on the covers of books or anything. Well, not that we're cover of book level anyway, probably, but we could be inside flap. Like, I know we're at a level where we could be inside flap.
Somewhere in the middle on the back, maybe, of like the reprint. You know, like we could get something one day. But... we aspire to that, but we'll see. Yeah. The other thing is, I recently dabbled in the capital F fiction world as well, and I read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
Isn't it Tomorrow and Tomorrow?
Is it tomorrow, and I don't know. I think that's it. Is it tomorrow? It's Tomorrow and Tomorrow. And Tomorrow.
No, you got it.
I got it by Gabrielle Zevin, Zevin, and there's kind of some interesting similarities here. There is definitely this. It's more of a commentary on the video game industry than the publishing industry, and it's not as pointed as I'm assuming Yellowface is, just from the description and Arv Kuang's own conversations on social media around the book and your take on the book. It's not nearly as pointed, but there is a lot about being a woman in the gaming industry in the early 90s and being in MIT in the early 90s and, you know, that kind of environment. And, you know, they were, of course, plenty of like, I think the main character, I think she was Asian too. Don't hold me to that. But Sadie Green, I actually don't think she was Asian, but I don't know. But it's really interesting kind of idea that this whole book is fueled by taking on the meta themes of an industry. You know, using truth is more real than fiction's more real than truth sometimes, or truth is stranger than fiction, and it
Nailed it.
it takes on a lot of themes, not as pointed, obviously, and it's a bit more dramatic and juicy and entertaining. In its focus, it's not focusing on taking down anybody or anything. It's a drama, but it's also got a lot of positivity in it as well. So it's just an entertaining story all around. But I think that would be like a good, and it's also just one of those like super popular book club everywhere kind of books. And I think, you know, it's been out long enough that it's kind of getting phased out of the current conversation, and Yellowface is coming in. That's kind of like how I feel about it, and I really enjoyed Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, and I would recommend it to anyone that is an avid fantasy reader and also really into video games, which I'm imagining there's quite a bit. It's kind of fun, and if you're if you're in that millennial generation or maybe a little older, there's a lot to enjoy about that kind of 90s nostalgia as well for a lot of these characters. So, but those, I can see some similarities there. What's also interesting is I was looking at, you know, fellow Tulane alum and three-time Hugo Award-winning author N.K. Jemisin.
Back.
Yeah, back to like swept the Hugos with her trilogy. She has a collection of short stories called How Long Till Black Future Month, which is a fantastic title, by the way. Till, like apostrophe Til, which I love. And that is like where she sharply examines modern society, you know, from a social standpoint, as N.K. Jemisin is so invested in and does so well with her other work. So that to me seems like something that might be a natural like segue back into fantasy. It's not necessarily about the publishing industry, but it's still like N.K. Jemisin, I think, would be, fans of her would definitely kind of cross over no problem because her social commentary is so good and nuanced and rich that it's like, hey, you want to see what it's like for a different perspective in a different industry, like in a publishing industry environment specifically. Like there's a lot to get into there. There's so much nuance and difference between these two authors' experiences that I think it would be cool to check out both. And Sarah El-Arifi, we've mentioned a couple times, her story about her experience with publishing was super fascinating as well. And I think, you know, starting to pick up her works, and we've seen pictures of Sarah and Rebecca hanging out. So, you know, there's a little bit of that networking adjacency there. So I would recommend any fans of Sarah's to check out Kuang and vice versa, you know. So those are just what comes to mind for me.
And check out our interviews with Sarah.
Oh, yeah.
Sarah's interviews are like, she always is such a phenomenal interviewee that, and we always get tons of positive feedback when we release an episode with Sarah on it. So tune into that. Not necessarily for us, but definitely for Sarah.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, there's just a lot to get into there around like the world of publishing that Sarah doesn't necessarily translate into her stories. Her stories are certainly about, you know, there's racism, classism, and things like that, but it's very fantastical. She's not like doing anything about the publishing industry. She's not being super pointed about like her own experience and stuff like that. But when you learn about her and you listen to our interviews with her, you'll get that experience, and it will kind of help contextualize the kind of things that R.F. Kuang is writing about and talking about in publishing too. There's just a lot to get into, and that's why we love to talk to authors, you know, getting all those different stories, not just the actual stories that they write, but the stories that they tell, right, Dylan?
Oh, well done, Charles. Yeah, every author that we've talked to has a completely unique experience as to how they got to where they are. And it's always, like you said, fascinating to hear from them. And I'm sure, like, if Sarah wanted to follow a similar career path of writing this more military fantasy sort of book at the beginning of her career and then get into stuff that's more like this examination of what's going on with the real world or real world publishing industry, I think she would absolutely kill it, because she's got so many like really thoughtful and interesting things to say about all of that. It's and it's N.K. Jemisin, also a fantastic person to connect to this, because she gets into these similar themes and issues with all of her work that I've read. And like you said, most of the time it's more like staying in the fantasy or sci-fi genres. But if folks, it's all just storytelling, even if it's a very different setting. It's all storytelling that can tell us all sorts of things about our current world, even if it's through the lens of a secondary world. I mean, a lot of times those are the things that we love about fantasy. Like we did that episode way back, like why do we love fantasy or something? And we love, I believe we referenced Rebecca Kuang's work before she'd ever published anything like Yellowface, where we were saying it gives us the opportunity to look at things that take place in our real world, but from a like decontextualized manner, where we're not stuck as much in our own like experiences and biases as we would be if you start telling the story in the actual world. So love that about fantasy, love that about N.K. Jemisin's work. And then if you want to see it play out in the more real world setting, particularly in the publishing industry, then Yellowface is a great fit for you.
Wow, well said, Dylan. The other thing, like, this book is easily digestible for us people used to fantasy stories, so that also is appealing. Like whenever the next quick reprieve I get between stories, I'm gonna see if I can sneak this one in. It is very much like a sneak-inable story.
That's what I did. I snuck it in. I basically, like I said, audiobooked it in a day. I think the length is, I listened to it at 1.5 speed, so it was under 6 hours for me. The length is 8 hours and 39 minutes if you listen to it at regular speed.
Okay.
I mean, you got a long car ride, just go for it.
A very long car ride indeed. All right. Well, that I think wraps it up, Dylan. We've talked plenty in a spoiler-free fashion about Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I don't think there's anything left to do but play that sweet, sweet outro music. What do you say?
Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right. Thank you all so much for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, do us a favor and let us know over on the socials. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they love what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than following us over on social media, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify. Just 2 clicks over at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and it helps us so much when you do that. You can also rate and or review on Apple Podcasts. Anytime you write one of those nice reviews and say good things about us, it puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing it.
Just listening, guys. More than enough. Thank you all so much for listening. You guys are awesome. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.